The senator from Ohio.
Madam President, we've had a great debate here on the floor today about the budget, and what we've heard is the fact that in the face of unprecedented debts and deficits, we need to get spending under control and grow the economy. Unfortunately, the Democrat budget that's been presented doesn't do that because it actually increases spending, increases taxes, but there is an alternative, and that is to restrain spending in ways that are smart, but also get this economy moving so we have more revenue, and revenue the way we ought to get it, which is through growth. One obvious way to do that is through tax reform. We just had a vote on a tax reform proposal. I'm offering a couple of amendments that I'd like to talk about tonight. One is with regard to tax reform on the business side, which is one where there is an amazing consensus now between Democrats, Republicans, the White House, and the Capitol on how to get this economy moving again by ensuring that our tax code becomes more competitive globally. Not to cut taxes, not to raise taxes, but in a revenue-neutral way to improve the way we collect taxes at the business level to be sure we can create more jobs here at a time where we're suffering through the worst recovery we've had since the Great Depression. Second, I'm going to offer an amendment that ensures that we have the right information from the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Tax, which are the two groups that give us information here on Capitol Hill, as to what tax reform means, because we want to be sure that as we reform our tax code, we do it in a way that's pro-growth and pro-jobs. Fundamental tax reform should be done across the board, in my view, not just on the business side, but also on the individual side. On the individual side, we have a great opportunity to broaden the base of tax, lower the rates, to make the code, again, more pro-growth. Most businesses in America pay their taxes through the individual tax code because they are what's called pass-through entities, about 85% of businesses. They tend to be smaller businesses. That's very important. But tonight I'm going to talk about the other part of that, which is the business tax code that relates to primarily our larger companies and a lot of the international companies, the so-called C corporations. Back in 1986, we actually reduced the rate on the corporate side from 46% down to 34%. That was 1986. It was done in a bipartisan way with Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill. And the idea at that time was to take our tax rate down to the point that it was competitive, meaning that it was below the average of our global competitors. In the intervening 2.5 decades, guess what's happened? Every single country of the developed world, the so-called OECD countries, our global trading competitors, every single one of them have gone in and reformed their tax code. They've lowered their rates, but they've also made their code more competitive. Every single country except us. So America's been on the sidelines while other countries have moved quickly to improve their tax code. Why? Because they want investment, they want the jobs, and what's happened is, sure enough, they're more competitive. Capital is now flowing outside of this country. We're losing headquarters. We're in a situation where if there's a foreign acquisition to be made, those companies in foreign countries have an advantage because they have a more competitive tax code. Our tax rate, which in 1986 was purposely put in place to be just below the average of all the developed economies in the world, is now number one. It's the highest rate in the world. That's a number one you don't want to have. Japan just lowered their rate last year, putting America as the top corporate tax rate in the world. This means, again, we're losing people, we're losing capital, we're losing headquarters. We can't keep up. So what's the solution? Well, let's go do what we did back in 1986 again, and let's do it quickly, and let's do it on a bipartisan basis because everybody seems to agree that our current code is not competitive, that the rate is too high. We have some disagreements on how to correct it, but actually there's a growing consensus about that as well. The White House has talked about this. In fact, in a February 2012 white paper issued by the Treasury Department, they said, let's lower the rate of corporate taxation by broadening the base, meaning reducing or getting rid of a lot of the preferences that are built up in the tax code. And by the way, hundreds of them have been built up in the tax code since 1986. So not only has our rate become high because other countries have lowered theirs, we've added more and more complications to our tax code. It's not just the White House is talking about this. In front of our committee, the Budget Committee, a professor came to talk to us who was the Democrat witness. This wasn't the Republican witness who was gung-ho also on doing corporate tax reform. This was the Democrat witness. This is what he said. Corporate income tax's statutory rate of 35% is far outside world norms. The rate needs to come down. I therefore conceive of a corporate reform as roughly revenue neutral, in which corporate tax base will be broadened through closing business tax expenditures and loopholes, and resulting in revenues being used to pay down the corporate rate. Pay down the corporate rate. In the paper from the Treasury Department in February 2012, they said we should reinvest the savings you get from getting rid of some of these loopholes and expenditures and use it to, as they said, invest in lowering the rate. So here we have an opportunity as a Congress, Republicans, Democrats alike, to do something that's good for jobs. And by the way, the Congressional Budget Office has looked at this in terms of who benefits. It's not the corporate boardroom that benefits. It's the workers. They've said that 70% of the benefit of lowering the rate, the corporate rate, is going to go to workers in the form of higher salaries, better benefits, and more jobs. By the way, the Congressional Budget Office has also said that if you'd like to get this economy moving, probably the best bang for your buck is going to be do something on the corporate tax code because it has gotten so complex and the rate has gotten so high. If you do this, you're also doing something we ought to be doing generally in our tax code, which is you're not picking winners and losers. Instead of the government stepping in and deciding where resources are allocated, you have the private sector doing that, market forces doing that, which is going to help grow the economy. So just as President Reagan and Democrats did in 1986, we should cap or eliminate inefficient tax preferences and loopholes. We should use that revenue to reduce both the corporate rate and the individual rate without adding to the deficit. Another amendment of mine takes this same idea, which is tax reform on the individual and corporate side, and allows us as legislators to understand better what we're doing. Right now, when the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation give us an analysis of taxes, they tell us what the revenue is likely to be based on what they call a static score. A static score. It doesn't really take into account the big macroeconomic changes you're likely to see from people's changed behavior from lower rates, for instance. Give you an example. Back in 2003, the capital gains tax, as you know, was reduced. And so what did they say? Well, the Joint Committee on Taxation and CBO did their analysis. They said, well, that means because you've lowered the rate of taxation that you're going to get less revenue, right? Because you have less taxes coming in. No, because they lowered the capital gains revenue, there was more economic activity. It turns out we actually got more revenue in. And so in 2007, they said revenues were going to go down. In fact, revenues shot up. The same thing happened, by the way, back in 1997, the last time this Congress had a unified balanced budget, when Bill Clinton was president, and he worked with the Republican Congress to get some of the spending under control, as we talked about earlier, but also they cut the capital gains rate, and lo and behold, as I recall, about $100 billion showed up on the revenue side that folks didn't expect, because we'd lowered the capital gains rate, and because the behavioral change, the dynamic scoring, the macroeconomic scoring showed that that was going to happen, but the static score didn't. So as we begin to formulate what kind of tax reform we should do, on the individual side, on the corporate side, wouldn't it be great if we had access to two kinds of analysis? One, the static score. That'll continue to be the official analysis. Nothing changes there. But also, why shouldn't we have access to the macroeconomic analysis, not done from the outside, not groups on the outside that might have a pretty aggressive dynamic score, but let's just use the macroeconomic model that the Joint Tax Committee already does. In fact, they're required to look at it in 3 different ways. CBO already does. It doesn't add more work in the sense that this analysis is already being done. It's just that we aren't getting the benefit of it. So this second amendment that I hope my Democrat colleagues can also support, as I hope they will the first one, says quite simply, let's have more information so we can make smarter decisions. Who could be against that? Some have said, well, we don't believe in dynamic scoring. Fine. If you don't believe in dynamic scoring, let's see what happens. We're going to have a static score, which will be the official score still. That's what we'll have to use around here. Then we'll have the dynamic score. And again, we want that so we can formulate a better tax reform proposal, but also to know what the impact's going to be. And we'll see what happens. My belief is that the macroeconomic score is more likely to be accurate, as it has been in the past. And over time, I wouldn't be surprised if this Congress decides, my gosh, that's more consistent with the behavior changes you're going to see with good tax reform. Let's make that part of the official analysis. But that's not what we're talking about here tonight. The official score would still be the static score. I believe that this will enable us to be better legislators and certainly will enable us to have an opportunity as we look at this budget deficit and these historic debts and the impact it's having on our kids and our grandkids and on today's economy to come together as Republicans and Democrats and do the 2 things everybody knows has to be done. One, restrain spending, specifically to deal with these really important but unsustainable entitlement programs. Remember, this Congressional Budget Office has told us in their report just about 2 weeks ago that the growth of Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, incredibly important programs, and that's why we need to save them, that growth will go up by 94% over the next 10 years. It nearly doubles. In fact, they've told us that as a percent of the economy, which is how they look at the spending, as a percent of the economy, the only growth in our spending over the next 10 years is going to be from these entitlement programs and interest on the debt. Other parts of our budget actually, as percent of the economy, are going to be flat or even a little bit below the percent of the GDP. But what's going to grow dramatically are these programs. So we know we have to have entitlement reform to save these programs so that the trust funds don't go insolvent, which they otherwise will. But we also know that as part of that, we should do tax reform. Those two together, entitlement reform, smart reforms to make these programs work better, to ensure they're there for the future, and then tax reform that is pro-growth, that's going to generate revenue to help us, because they will change people's behavior, which will change economic growth, which will in turn provide more revenue. Revenue, really the right way, will help us get the debt and deficit under control, and at the same time, give people the opportunity to get back to work, deal with this weakest economic recovery since the Great Depression, help us to get out of the doldrums we're in right now in this economy. The shot in the arm that tax reform can give us, particularly if we have the right information from these organizations here on the Hill, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation, will enable us to move this country forward in ways that can be bipartisan, in ways that can be consistent with what the administration and the Congress is talking about: restraining spending, growing the economy. So, Madam President, thanks for letting me talk about this tonight. I look forward to having these amendments offered tomorrow. I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will be willing to stand together and to say, yeah, we can do this. We can get this economy moving. We're going to have to change the way we deal with our tax system. We're going to have to restrain the spending. And if we do that, our future can be brighter.